All right. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is titled Article 1, Fostering a More Deliberative Process in Congress. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. So today's hearing continues an exploration of Article 1, principles and ways to restore Congress to its rightful place as first among the co-equal branches of government. A few weeks ago, we had what I thought was a really interesting and productive hearing on how and why Congress has reduced its own capacity to fulfill its constitutional obligations. We know that the framers never intended for extraordinarily consequential decisions to be made by one person or one branch of government. This committee's challenge, and it's one we take seriously, is to figure out how to rebuild Congress's capacity so that we can better serve the American people. The House of Representatives is often referred to as the People's House because the framers envisioned its members as closest to the people and their opinions. Our job as House members is to give voice to the people we represent. It's not always easy because we are a nation of diverse views, but that's the beauty of our system. The People's House embodies an amazing array of opinions and perspectives on the issues of the day, and through the process of debate and deliberation and compromise, we determine policy. At least that's how it's supposed to work. The framers intended for Congress to be a deliberative body. They wanted a system where representatives of a diverse population would come together and engage in extended periods of debate and deliberation. Through this process, they would learn different viewpoints and eventually reach consensus. Those who lost out would at least be satisfied that their voices were heard and be more inclined to accept outcomes as legitimate. Compromise necessitates trade-offs, which means that no one is going to be 100% happy with the final product. But losing out on policy goals is tempered by at least having a say in the process. I know that may seem of little consequence, especially when the policies we're battling over matter deeply to our constituents. But the ability to articulate an argument, to counter an opposing position, and engage in a thoughtful exchange of ideas matters. It matters a lot. Debate exposes us to perspectives that are different from our own and requires us to really think through our positions in order to build the best arguments we can. This process is quite different from conjuring up quick political zingers to throw back and forth. The catch is that a more deliberative approach to policymaking takes time. It requires a willingness to engage on all sides of a complex issue. Despite the challenges, I think it's possible to find ways to encourage more thoughtful debate and deliberation in Congress, even in today's polarized environment. This committee has demonstrated that it's possible. We have tough discussions, we listen to each other, and we find common ground. I'm incredibly proud of the fact that we've managed to unanimously pass 45 recommendations to make Congress work better for the American people. So I look forward to hearing recommendations from our witnesses for how to encourage a more deliberative process, and I'd like to invite our Vice Chair, Tom Graves, to share some opening remarks as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it was good to be with you this morning as we took the committee on sort of a road show and had an opportunity to share a little bit about the success of the committee and some of our goals and plans as we move ahead. And today is one of those days that we continue talking about some of the topics that are important. Since we started holding hearings together and having discussions on how to make Congress work better for the American people, the importance of bipartisan relationships and communication here in Congress have been on the top of our minds, and I think everyone here that we serve with. A recent survey found that 93% of Americans see incivility as a problem in our society. And according to those, Congress and politicians are the ones to blame. So it seems like we have a lot of work to do, a lot ahead and on our plate. But this challenge and this known information here, it presents an opportunity. It actually presents an opportunity for us to seek out, to identify, and ultimately fix the root of this problem. Now, our last set of recommendations were designed to enhance civility throughout the House. Today, we're taking it a step further by looking at the rules and the procedures of this institution and how they shape our attitudes towards one another. It's important that we continue to identify ways to improve the process so the legislation that we produce is better for the American people. So I look forward to today's hearing and hearing from our witnesses. And Mr. Chairman, again, appreciate you holding this hearing today. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Today we welcome the testimony of our three witnesses. First witness is Dr. Norman Ornstein. Dr. Ornstein is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies politics, elections, and Congress. He previously served as co-director of the AEI Brookings Election Reform Project and senior counselor to the Continuity of Government Commission. A longtime observer and analyst of American politics and Congress, Dr. Ornstein has been involved in political reform for decades. He was elected Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2004. Dr. Ornstein's books include It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism, and The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track. We're killing it on Amazon.com book suggestions in this committee. Our next witness is Dr. Carolyn Lukens Meyer. She's the Executive Director Emerita of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, an organization that works to reduce political dysfunction and incivility in our political system. Dr. Lukens Meyer previously served as founder and president of America Speaks, an award-winning nonprofit organization that promoted nonpartisan initiatives to engage citizens and leaders through innovative public policy tools and strategies. Dr. Lukens Meyer also served as consultant to the White House Chief of Staff from 1993 to 94 and on the National Performance Review, where she steered internal management and oversaw government-wide reforms. Last but not least is Dr. James Curry, an associate professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of Political Science at the University of Utah. Dr. Curry's research focuses on U.S. politics and policymaking, especially the U.S. Congress. Specifically, he analyzes how contemporary legislative processes and institutions affect legislative politics, with a particular focus on the role of parties and leaders in the U.S. Congress. Dr. Curry previously worked on Capitol Hill as an American Political Science Association Fellow and also serves on the American Political Science Association's Congressional Reform Task Force. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes, and without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Dr. Ornstein, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. And I want to just start by saying, for all who care about this institution, I want to thank you for taking on this task, which is not quite a thankless task, but not a thankful task with all the other commitments that you have. I came here in 1969 to work in this body, and I've been basically immersed in it for 5 decades. And I want to just offer some ideas that fit with this theme especially, and I think your initial comments are spot on. The framers expected debate and deliberation, and to be frank, we have seen very little of that on either side of the Capitol, the way any of us would want to define debate and deliberation, and I think we can do a better job of it. My first suggestion is one that I've made for decades here, and that is to have some real Oxford-style debates in the House. I'd call them the Great American Debates. I'm actually going to San Francisco next week to do one of these intelligence squared debates on the value of the two-party system. And the format there, which is similar to an Oxford-style one with 2 on each side, is not a bad one to follow. I'd like to see, if it were at all possible, a weekly debate. You could do it in special order periods. And I'd like to see the issues that confront the nation, that Congress is supposed to confront and doesn't always, that are not always divided along Democratic and Republican or even liberal and conservative lines. It doesn't have to be 2 Democrats against 2 Republicans in every one. That would really let people know that Congress is grappling with these things and give them some ideas about what the dilemmas are. So the value of these debates, I would say, are multiple. First, they're going to show that you're grappling with problems. Second, they'll showcase members who've thought about and have ideas about these important issues and challenges. They show a common understanding of problems and challenges that we face and with the differences that we have to surmount them. They show that not all divisions are partisan ones or tribal ones, and they can become a springboard for a broader debate in the media and around the country about the problems and the needs and the challenges. And I can imagine if you did this well, the NewsHour and other news programs would take the debates, use some excerpts, maybe bring members on and broaden the discussion about what we can do about them. And while C-SPAN would air the debates, and maybe other networks wouldn't, you put them up on YouTube, and they're going to be used in classrooms around the country and for people who do debate in programs and tournaments in the high school and college, at the high school and college level. And just as a quick aside, my family sponsors a debate camp for public school kids in the Washington, D.C. area. We had 185 kids last summer from 5th grade through high school. Watching these kids understand what it means to debate issues, learning about the substance, learning all sides, just as you said, transforms them And it shows that you can be civil and still have strong ideas and divisions. My second idea has to do with committees. And over the decades, I've watched the usual format, which is something that this institution, by and large, has been wedded to. And that is the group of members arrayed around the tables, witnesses sitting below them, opening statements, and then 5-minute rounds. And frankly, it rarely sheds light and usually just looks like a bunch of people shouting at each other. It's disjointed far more often than not because you move from one topic to another, and you usually end up having a ping pong with a majority and minority, and witnesses, if they're hostile witnesses, filibustering for 3 or 4 minutes and then getting a 5-minute breather in between. I think there are better ways to do this, and I'd like to see committees alter their rules to allow a variety of different formats. I'd like to see as more of a model 30-minute rounds. And those 30-minute rounds don't have to be one member for 30 minutes. You can get 5 or 6 members together and let them coordinate so that you can actually ask follow-up questions and have thematic work that can be done. And this can be done whether you're doing it in an investigative capacity or in a legislative capacity, or just to learn about something, as hearings often do. And second, I'd like to see you move to experiment with and use more often roundtables, where you would have not members here, witnesses here, but a table with members and maybe a few experts, and just have a discussion. Learn from them and exchange ideas and views. There's no reason why Congress has to fit with a format that has been tried and true but overdone and does not really give you the ability to deliberate. So if we can open up this process and have more variations and focus on what you can do to actually extract what you need from hearings rather than have it be a typical kind of show. That can work in some settings, as it can here, but in a whole lot of others it won't. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Dr. Lukens Meyer, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for holding this hearing and inviting me to share some insights on what is possible on this vitally important topic. Over the last 30 years, my work has focused on improving the performance of government at all levels and strengthening the collective voice of the American public in crucial decisions on policy and budget allocations. Given this experience and my deep commitment to the institutions of American democracy, I'm encouraged to see the Select Committee working to improve Congress's ability to carry out its constitutional duties as an equal member of government, equal branch of government. Without question, the behavior of members and focusing and fostering on respect and relationship is fundamental to being able to function as a body. Equally important is the focus you've chosen for this particular hearing in terms of the quality of debate and deliberation. It takes more than the behavior changes of members to achieve high-quality debate and deliberation. Whether you're in a corporation or halls of government or nonprofit entities or in our own families, when people begin to behave badly toward one another, underneath that, without exception, there are structural and systemic issues that have created the context for that misbehavior. So as the committee looks at its recommendation, the strongest message I would leave is in each choice you make, there's an impact on behavior and there's an impact on the structure or the system. Today, in the way Congress is working, most of the incentives are set up that support people to behave badly. We need to shift this context. Each of the measures that I'm recommending today are focused on congressional committees, the real incubators and engines of what can be accomplished in Congress. And equally important is every one that I'm recommending has already been demonstrated as successful either at the federal government level, state government, or local. My first suggestion, to hold annual off-site retreats, and I'm going to talk about 2 different kinds. One is just basically to create the opportunity for members and families to get together away from committee rooms, away from the halls of Congress, so that you're freed from the rigid constraints of business as usual or media constantly following you. Doing this will inevitably build up camaraderie amongst members and even create connections between families, which used to be much more standard here, as you well know. Given more context in a larger professional and more personal setting, inevitably, a kind of connection begins to be created between members with more understanding and mutual respect. In these retreats, you also can do policy issues where you could begin to discover, is there an area where there could be a possibility of compromise to work on in this committee in an upcoming session? Representative Cleaver isn't here, but the second retreat I'd like to recommend first came out of a group called the Working Group for a Working Congress, created in the House Civility Caucus in 2012 and 2013. The idea of the working group was to bring together a couple of committees where the chair and the ranking member agreed to do off-site retreats to plan the committee's annual work and to agree how they would work together. Chairman Kilmer, you already mentioned in your opening my second thought that I think is very important. It's specific skills to do debate and deliberation well. And members could be exposed to real training sessions during orientation. They should be bipartisan, they should be out of Congress, they should be led by professionals, and they should utilize methods that have been proven time and time again. If we think in recent history, think of the kids from Parkland who begin to get debate skills in elementary school and the way in which they were able to handle the onslaught of negative social media by using those skills to respond. The third is similar to what Norm was talking about, but bipartisan seating charts, both in hearing rooms and committee rooms. Instead of one party here, the other there, as you have done in your committee, mix them up. Same in the committee rooms around the table instead of on other sides. Change round tables at the hearings themselves. This room isn't a huge distance, most are worse, but where the dais is so far above whoever is doing the testifying, shift some appropriate committee hearings to roundtables, where you're mixed up, you can even have more different people to interact on the topic. Another structural change that could really help is a meeting prior to the hearing, where members and staffs get together to set goals for that hearing. The idea would be to come out of that session with how best to get the information needed from that hearing. This will, by definition, diffuse partisanship in advance, create laser focus, and better inform how the upcoming hearing should be run. I, too, think there's a great deal to be done in showcasing some of these reforms and the new way that media operates. Americans only have seen the standard way Congress operates. Get coverage on these shifts that allow Americans to see a different relationship in terms of how you operate together across the aisle. Hopefully we can cover some more in the question and answer time.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Curry, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Graves, members of the Select Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I want to just make a few important points with my limited time today. First, I'm going to suggest that Congress resist the temptation to try to solve what problems it has by returning to the so-called regular order processes. And second, I'm going to suggest that there are underappreciated benefits of non-regular order processes and that Congress may draw important lessons from understanding those benefits. But first, what is meant by a return to the regular order? Typically, it means returning to the standard legislative processes of Congress's past. This would mean more sequential, committee-driven legislative processes with more open and freewheeling committee markups and more open floor debate and amending procedures. It would also mean fewer closed rules on the floor and fewer decisions made behind the scenes. For many, these changes sound very appealing because they recall less partisan and contentious times of the past, back when these processes were the norm or the standard. But despite whatever other value these processes may have, it is a mistake to believe that a return to the regular order is necessarily the solution to improving deliberations today. In research I have conducted with Francis Lee, who testified before your committee in May, we find that Congress moved away from regular order processes because they were ill-suited to the contemporary political environment. Regular order processes worked well in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s to promote deliberation and compromise, but this was a period of muted partisanship and large and long-lasting congressional majorities. These same processes work poorly in today's environment of sharp party conflict, intense partisan constituencies, and small and fleeting congressional majorities. Under these conditions, regular order processes often just create opportunities for obstructionists to obstruct and politically motivated legislators to score political points. Congress turned instead to what political scientists call unorthodox processes because they proved more effective in this difficult environment, at least for passing legislation. By limiting the frequency of committee markups, closing down floor amendment, and moving a lot of important deliberations behind the scenes, these newer processes can sometimes help Congress find agreement, build bipartisan coalitions, and pass legislation. Now, it would be very foolish for me to sit here and suggest to you all that what you should do is push for processes that seem less open and less transparent. This would obviously be a non-starter. However, we can learn something from why these unorthodox and behind-the-scenes processes seems to sometimes work, and try to build from there. Specifically, these processes work for at least two reasons. One, they minimize opportunities for obstructionist tactics that are meant just purely for obstructionism. And second, they reduce incentives for legislators to play to intense partisan constituencies by moving more discussions and deliberations off camera. What I suggest Congress should do is take steps to create processes that have at least some of these benefits, that create conditions for members to deliberate rather than to play political games. Here I'm going to suggest two specific ideas. One idea is to eliminate roll call votes offered in the Committee of the Whole, or roll call votes on amendments offered in the Committee of the Whole. This was standard practice before the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970. Prior to that time, amendments in the Committee of the Whole had to be considered by voice or teller votes. This change would reduce the incentives for members to offer amendments that are destined to fail, but that only embarrass members or make them take difficult votes. Amendments that pass in the Committee of the Whole could then receive roll call votes later after the bill is referred back to the floor. But in the Committee of the Whole, this could possibly enable the House to allow for more open amending procedures without having to fear that these processes are simply going to be used to score political points. Second, the House could create more processes by which committee members or other groups of members can get together to just discuss, debate, and learn about more specific issues, policies, and federal programs. These types of activities are already institutionalized on foreign policy with things like codels. Committee-based codels that are focused on domestic policy may produce similar effects. Simply taking committee members out of Washington and off camera to learn more about specific domestic policies and programs together in bipartisan groups could engender substantive deliberations, debates, and even the building of the kind of relationships and trust often needed among members of Congress for sensitive policy negotiations. These are just two ideas, and I'm sure you all could come up with more and better ones, but in the meantime, I look forward to trying to answer whatever questions you may have.
Thanks so much to all three of you for your testimony. We'll move on to questions. And I guess I wanted to start, Dr. Ornstein and Dr. Lukens Meyer first. I guess the good news from some of your testimony in terms of how committees function is we're trying to do some of that, the staggered seating. We've done some roundtables where we bring in some expertise and just talk. The vice chair and I meet before every one of our hearings and try to figure out, so what do we want to get out of this hearing, and those sorts of things, which doesn't sound like rocket science so much as like good committee hygiene. I guess the question I have is, how do you incent committees to experiment with some of those more deliberative hearing formats? So I guess that's one question: is what how do you change the incentives in this place? Because no matter who's in the majority, there's always some peril, I think, in the perspective of the majority and being more collaborative, or the notion that you're giving up something, although I would argue that maybe you're getting something done. And then the other thing I wanted to ask about was, how do you handle it for big committees? Transportation infrastructure has 50 people or 60 people on it. So how would you handle that with one of those ginormous committees?
So on the latter point, I'd come back to what I'd suggested before. You can do 30-minute rounds, but not have every member have 30 minutes, which you couldn't do with a 60-member committee. But, what I've seen so often with hearings is you will have 5 minutes by a member, and then you'll have 5 minutes by a member from the other party. And then when you get to the next member, the 5 minutes will have nothing to do with the previous 10. There's no coordination, there's no continuity. If you said to 6 members of a 60-member committee, you've got 30 minutes, I want you all to sit together and figure out how you're going to frame and make thematic the kinds of questions you want to ask, you'd actually force them in some ways to do a better job of what they've been doing and think through what the goals are. And they aren't just what some individual thought up in his or her own mind or brings to the table for another set of reasons. On the larger point, it's very difficult. One thing I've realized in my decades around here is that inertia is a word that carries great weight, and changing the way things are done is very difficult to do. It's more difficult in this highly charged environment, and I think what it would take, I'd hate to see this done, although it may have to be done by a majority party acting alone. But Carolyn had mentioned retreats, and one of the things I've also suggested in the past, and I've suggested to some of your colleagues, is that committees and subcommittees do their own retreats. That's something that worked pretty well in the past. And sometimes it would be, I mean, I remember when the Ways and Means Committee used to do it on a fairly regular basis, and they'd actually get to know each other better. It made for a better atmosphere in the committee, but they could talk through things, bring in some experts and work it out. If you had a subcommittee or a committee get together and talk about better ways in which they could hold hearings, you might get, if not a consensus, at least a broader understanding that we ought to work in different ways. It's not going to be an easy thing to do. I can tell you that a couple of decades of pushing on the debate issue, and I finally had a fleeting success in the House. But what happened was a primetime debate where instead of doing it with 2 on each side, every subcommittee chair and ranking member with a sliver of jurisdiction was included in the debate package. So you'd have a 1-minute opening and a 15-second rejoinder, and it was the worst of all possible worlds. It has to be done with some discipline, and it's going to take leadership on both sides to at least experiment with these things, and then once they start to work, maybe get it spread more widely.
Dr. Lukens Meyer, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'd like a couple of comments on the incentivizing and then again on how to deal with the large committees. I know that in Congress it is not typical to focus on learnings that can come from state legislatures, but I actually think this is an arena in which there's some pretty extraordinary data over the last 5 years of when some of what I have recommended is being done in state legislatures, and it is leading to more relationships across the aisle, and the most important thing, more bipartisan legislation being introduced and passed. The example of just changing chairs, in 2019, both the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House in Maine decided to do that in the Maine chambers. So it is RD sitting totally in when they are operating in the House and in the Senate. And members from both parties are actively out talking about how this has improved their relationships and has led to the actual passage of more bipartisan legislation. This kind of work has now been done in 16 states by the National Institute for Civil Discourse. More than 1,000 members have gone through the kind of training in terms of what are the skills it takes to listen. So I think one incentive might be to make it visible to Congress that this is working in other legislative bodies. I think another incentive is pretty dramatic when the public sees members operating in a different way. And there's some experience here in terms of members going together to each other's districts, like someone from Northern Michigan on infrastructure with someone from South LA on infrastructure, where you couldn't have 2 more diverse populations. They see their members together behaving, even big differences on policy issues. So I think the actual experience of doing this both out in front of the public is another potential way to incentivize it. I really think, I know resources are a real challenge, and that's in fact one of the things you mentioned in your opening that's made this more difficult, but I think leadership, really selecting to make a priority providing more resources for the kind of retreats that both Norm and I have talked about is another important incentive. One comment, if I may, about your important question about the size of the large committees. When we, in fact, were working with Representative Cleaver and Granger, one of the committees we chose was transportation because the transportation bill affects so many Americans, more of them are aware of it. And one of the processes in the end, it didn't get to happen because of politics, but the plan was to have the committee both work in plenary and then in a highly designed, facilitated process, spend portions of their time working in smaller groups. They're still in the committee hearing room, they're still in the agenda of that committee meeting, but part of the time is spent in real working on subtasks, which then come back together to the full committee. Is that helpful?
It is. Thank you. Let me recognize Mr. Graves, Vice Chair Graves, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Ornstein, I want to follow up on, you mentioned debate. I never participated in debate classes. My parents might have made the argument that I was a good arguer, good at arguing, and but never really learned debate. What would your measure of that be here? Because it's really not, the structure is not set up to where that dialogue does occur. It seems like each committee and even the House floor is not positioned in a way that we are there to persuade opinion. It's more we are articulating a singular point, defending something rather than persuasion. Any recommendations on how we might provide a structure that could occur?
So I will say Bob Lighton, who's a scholar at Brookings, has just written a book trying to make debate universal in the country and schools, and not just organized tournaments, but debate-centered education. It makes a huge difference, and where it's been tried in a couple of places, it's improved test scores. It's really been enormously important. It's not a function of the House. Frankly, not of the Senate either. The closest I've seen to debates in the Senate is sometimes there'll be an organized colloquy with 2 members, and they'll go on, and, as they can do in the Senate, for a long period of time. What we celebrate as the great debate in the House, and I was there at the time, was before we went into the first Gulf War, when we had no idea whether it would be an extended war that would have enormous casualties. And we had members on the floor. It was emotional, it was highly charged, but it was basically a series of speeches. It was successive speeches. And that's not debate. Now, I think that you can do this, but you can't do it in the usual way in which you have a floor debate. You've got to organize it, you've got to structure it, and you need to have a smaller number of members. And once you start to do it that way, if you're grappling with a larger issue and you can talk about the nuances and you can argue back and forth, but in a civil fashion, I think it will change the tenor of the place. Now, I agree with Carolyn that you may want to do a little training for people who haven't done debate. Plenty of your members did. You can't go into a law firm and throw a rock without hitting somebody who was a debater in high school or college. But it can improve your own skills. And in the same way, if you do roundtables in hearings, you're much more likely to be able to get some extended discussion and maybe even some real deliberation. So there are ways to do it, but you can't do it just with the old formats and structures that you've used on the floor or in committees.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it would be useful, and in fact, it'd probably be helpful to have an audience as well. We don't
I
often
honestly
have
believe
that.
that if you do this, if you build it, they will come. And what you're going to see is not necessarily with people watching it on C-SPAN when it happens. It's going to have a life of its own, and it will prove useful in a lot of places. Right. If I were in a high school classroom and I were teaching a course on any of a number of subjects, make it climate change even, and I had a real debate with people who are making these decisions, arguing different points, it would be so useful to me to use in the classroom. And if I were teaching debate or speech, as they did at Parkland, what better way also to improve the image of Congress than to show serious people actually debating serious issues instead of what we often see.
Right, thank you. And when I say audience, Mr. Chairman, I mean members who are making decisions being participants in an actual debate and trying to grapple with a difficult topic. One final question, Dr. Curry, maybe you could help us with this. We've heard from other members who have spoken to this committee and said that they just feel like they don't count, they don't matter. They can't make a difference. In fact, it was Reed Ribble who testified before us, a former member who left. And when asked why he left, he had more to do. He was a very talented member, and he was, in fact, elected with many of us here on this panel. And his conclusion was he found out he just didn't matter. He had bipartisan legislation. He served on a committee. His party was in control, and he couldn't even get a hearing. Couldn't even get a hearing when he had all the levers were in his favor, and yet it didn't matter. And he found out he ultimately didn't matter, so he left. Any recommendations on that? How members can feel a sense of purpose here in what they do?
Well, I think what you point to right here is the real downside to the way that power and authority and process have centralized in the House and in Congress over the past several decades, is that what the real consequence of it is that it cuts out a lot of members who aren't all the way up the ladder in the legislature. That's, from a leadership perspective, part of that's done is because of fear, that if you allow things to be opened up, you lose control, and also you can end up with a situation where there's just a lot of political point scoring, a lot of obstructionism going on. I think that's why, to try to help members like Congressman Riggleman and others who have the same feeling, which I imagine is really common, is to try to create structures where things can be open, but where it's hard for people to just play to the cameras and put people on notice and try to, get them in trouble on Twitter, for example. And that can mean not having more processes where the cameras are off, having more processes where not every vote is recorded in that sort of way that we do with the voting cards and the electronic voting, where there can be more opportunities for people to put ideas out there and try to influence what comes out at the end of the day without having to worry about every offer they make, everything they say, and every decision that they take coming back to haunt them later in some partisan fashion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pocan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. So let me play a little off of that. One of my, I don't know if I call it a pet peeve, that's probably not right, but someone talked me off the ledge on why the MTR is an incredible waste of everyone's breath. We do this motion to recommit. Supposedly it gives the power to the minority to put an amendment on the bill, but the amendment often has really nothing to do with the bill. They find the farthest edge gray zone they can get, so you can do a gotcha. It used to always be a procedural vote, which still would be a waste of time. Now it's just a waste of time because sometimes people vote for it, sometimes they don't based on the content. And then they're never going to vote for the bill if it gets added. It doesn't matter which party's doing it. Why is the MTR useful? Or can you reform it to actually make it useful? Help me understand this, 'cause I just feel like it is an incredible waste of time.
That's a toughie, but it's a reflection of a larger phenomenon and problem. You can have structures and rules put in place for a particular purpose, and if the norms erode, the purpose goes away. Certainly, there is a substantial reason for having something like a motion to recommit. We don't want a body where the minority has no voice or no opportunity to raise its own policy ideas. The way a parliamentary system works, we're not a parliamentary system, but you want to have that opportunity. You hope you could have that opportunity with more open rules. And of course, it used to be that, getting to Vice Chairman Graves' point, the rank and file members of the majority were often as upset with closed rules as the members of the minority because their ideas were no longer considered. But it has devolved into something much worse. The only answer that I can give without getting a broader understanding that if we're going to keep it, we have to have a norm that returns that it's actually going to be a minority party's alternative is at least have it filed in advance and debated in the Rules Committee so that everybody knows what that is instead of having it sprung at the end. And maybe that would provide at least a little bit of boundaries around what's done. But balancing majority and minority rights and responsibilities here has become much harder in the last 10 years than it used to be, the last 15.
Yeah, anyone have a better answer?
I don't have a better answer. I mean, I'm glad you were talked off the ledge of the MTR being completely useless, because they're very.
I'm not off that ledge.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that. I mean, by definition, if it's going to be, it's a partisan procedure, and that the minority party gets to offer this, and so because it's framed that way, to some degree, it's going to be sort of done to score partisan political points. And so, and again, I would also be hesitant to say that it's something you should get rid of, because it's important for the minority to have rights. But maybe there's a better way to offer minority party input at a different point in the process, not at the very end on the floor when everything's going to be recorded and the cameras are on. If the goal is really to give the minority an opportunity to have input on what this policy might or could look like.
Yeah, some people have said if you have an open rule, you don't really need it, because someone could have had an amendment. If it's a closed rule, you have to have something. Problem is, most of ours are structured rules, so it's some kind of hybrid. So a lot of us just try to figure it out because it doesn't make a lot of sense. If I can, a second thing, to your very point, Dr. Ornstein, about the 5 minutes. So I was at a hearing once where we were talking about mental health and the facilities that were holding a lot of the kids from the border. And what's the name of the facility? I looked it up because I wanted to find it here. The one down in Florida, I'm forgetting it hand, Homestead. We found out that by asking a question that we were paying 80% of the cost for having no one in beds, and we were paying for 1,200 beds. Why we weren't paying for 100 beds, I don't know, but somehow we agreed 1,200 beds at an 80% cost. It was pretty eye-opening. But then, because everyone wanted to have a Twitter moment or whatever else, you go back to what you're going to ask. We never actually got any more information about it. Luckily, that exposure, I think, helped them to get it down to zero at $0 a day, but there is really no way to kind of have that continue to be the conversation. I suppose you could do the 30-minute rounds, but all the committees are pretty big, and then that becomes hard unless it's done in a subcommittee. Any other ideas on the debate side to get it to be more relevant and useful?
I don't know that it's a new idea from what we've said, but I think the theme for me and your example fits it perfectly, is that over the decades in which power has been centralized, committees have less room to actually operate the way they had typically operated with a better relationship with majority and minority. I think it's demonstrating, picking some unique settings to demonstrate that it is possible to do this differently, and then kind of ease step by step into the structure where the norms have just been debased to the level that it's almost not functional. So it's highlighting a way we can do this different, have some successes in that context, and see if it can't, by osmosis, begin to move back into the original structures.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Doctor. Appreciate your testimony. You know, kind of piggybacking on to what my good friend Mr. Pocan said, you know, talking about debates. You know, I noticed, Dr. Ornstein, that you mentioned debate training, and Dr. Lukens Meyer, you talk about skills training in your testimony. I'm assuming, you know, from your testimony, it's similar to debate training. I would argue that if you want to create a video of great debate opportunities, get us to debating the value of the rock band Nickelback on the House floor.
So the first debate is that actually a band? I understand, but
Sir, I did not yield you any of my time. I deserve more time now, Mr. Chair. We know the outcome of this. Nickelback is a great band. His time's expired. But listen, I love some of your suggestions, all of you. I love this bipartisan seating, but it also takes a certain type of legislator who wants to get to know the other side to make it successful. But I do believe the proximity seating has been helpful, but it's also conducive to this committee. So, Dr. Lukens Meyer, you mentioned skills training, and I noticed it in your recommendations, it's a shorter paragraph. Is there anything else besides debate training, anything else that you might be able to give us as a recommendation of what you mean by skills training that can help us move beyond the partisanship?
Well, in the testimony, I specifically focused on debate and deliberation, given that's the part of Article 1 you were looking at. But I think in the work we've done across the country, It's interesting that where most legislators who we've interacted with, the bigger eye-opening part of the experience of going through these kinds of workshops is putting more attention on the capacity to listen and to specifically listen for understanding. So the goal of our first round of conversation is not, as you said, Vice Chair Graves, to be effective at arguing, but to actually demonstrate that I am learning why you hold the view you hold on this policy. That's the goal of the first round of conversation. And we have found that extremely influential then in terms of how a committee, whether it's in Idaho or in New York, how they go to the next step of getting back to the substance of what they want to accomplish in the committee. Because every member is now sitting on a comprehension of why you came out to think we should do this in terms of beds in Homestead and why I think we shouldn't. So, and frankly, like there's been good social science research to show that all of us think we operate on a little higher standard of ethics than we actually do in a pragmatic day-to-day. The same thing's true of listening. We all count ourselves as being much better listeners than we actually are, but most of the structures we're in set us up to be, I'm listening to you only to do my counterpoint. So it slows down the process, but our experience has been that it's been extremely helpful to work both in committees and in other hearings.
Wow, well, there goes my counterpoint. I can't argue with you now. I'm only listening.
Somehow.
No, great. I completely agree, and I think we all do need to listen and hear more outside. Forgive the humor, but humor is part of being able to develop those relationships too. And Dr. Curry, I'd like to turn to you. Today's day and age, we just talked about Mr. Pocan, and we talk about people wanting that social media moment. They want that news hit there. It's that instant gratification. Whereas, we used to think people watch C-SPAN. Now we know they don't, but they do get on Twitter and they do get on other social media. I think that it allows our constituents to actually interact with us even more. You study Congress for a living. Obviously, you chose the wrong profession. What can we do to make sure that we don't allow ourselves to get caught up in that instant gratification moment and then still be able to serve our constituents? Because really, truly, that's our number one job.
Yeah, I don't think there's a perfect catch-all answer to how to do that. I think part of it is remembering that the typical American is not the person yelling on Twitter. Most Americans are not that engaged in the day-to-day of politics. They're engaged in a general sense, but they're not engaged in that day-to-day give and take. So when you're hearing, I think it's important for everyone to remember, including members of Congress, but also just the rest of us.
Can I ask you a quick question on that?
Yeah.
Because I'm running out of time, and I usually abuse this privilege with
Yeah.
Chair Kilmer, and he's not going to let me much more. But do you think, I can tell you as a member of Congress, I will get asked about 3 comments on social media by reporters.
Yeah.
And I have to remind them, I represent 700,000 people. You're talking 3 people that may or may not even live in my district. Why are you using that as a reason to create discontent in a news story?
Well, I think your answer is the correct answer, that this is not necessarily representative of all the people I represent. And we know that from plenty of research that's been done, that the typical American doesn't participate at that level, that the people who are yelling and screaming tend to not be super representative. So I think, 1, it's important to remember that. And then 2, it's important to try to turn to ways of having members be able to talk to each other in situations where there's always this incentive or this pull to play to the cameras because those loud people are going to be out there. And so having more opportunities where the cameras are off to talk with folks. And there's probably a lot of ways you could try to do that. You might have to deal with backlash from people saying, oh, they're reducing transparency. But maybe there's ways to do it that don't come across in that way, because that's the best way you can get to know why someone else thinks what they do and offer up ideas without having to fear that Twitter backlash or wherever it is in the future, is to not have it so that those backlashes could occur instantaneously in a way that's just damaging to real deliberation.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks. The Great Nickelback debate of 2020 may be our only chance of going viral on social media, so thank you for that. Next up, Ms. Del Bene.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will not continue that debate. I want to thank all of you for being here. This has been a very interesting discussion. Dr. Lukens Meyer, you talked about field hearings and district visits. And I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about that more. One of the topics we talk a lot about is schedule. And so how does that fit in when we have a pretty busy schedule too? And I think people feel the need to be home, and how could we fit that type of work in a way that would make it more than just a one-time, one-off thing, but more a regular part of our process? Do you have ideas about that?
Sorry, that's a great question, and I recognize that the demands on your time are ludicrous, actually. I think what we've seen in the members who have done it, number one, they're not trying to do it terribly frequently, but I'll take the example of Representative Stover and Representative Beatty from Ohio. They chose to go together because they were in conjoining districts, which made it simpler in terms of the scheduling and in terms of the travel. They also are very different ideologically, and that was part of their goal in terms of presenting themselves to the public in terms of, we have very different perspectives on these issues, but we can be here and share this with our constituents and actually demonstrate that it's possible for us to share some values and to interact with you as the public, both on what we agree on and what we disagree on. The part that my experience with the pairs that we've done this with is that the response from the public is so positive in terms of how surprised they are to see members of opposite parties jointly doing something together in each other's districts, that it becomes self-reinforcing as a highly valuable step to take. Also, they get fantastic media coverage out of it, both traditional sources and social media sources. I don't think this would ever become a frequent opportunity. Some other examples have focused more on where, the example I gave before was where a member from northern Michigan and from southern California, each of whose districts have huge infrastructure issues, but completely different infrastructure issues. So it gave them an opportunity to really learn from one another's constituents how there might be some link between an omnibus bill on infrastructure that might move through the House.
What about at the committee level and doing field hearings? Does anyone have feedback on how helpful that is in terms of getting not just a couple members together, but actually getting a committee maybe to go someplace?
This used to happen much more often than it does now. And I know this, I was chief of staff in the state of Ohio and participated in a fair number of field hearings of committees. And what we learned there was they only have high value if they are not overly orchestrated. That many times the public's reaction to those hearings were, wait a minute, I showed up here because I actually really wanted to say something, and obviously everybody who spoke was chosen ahead of time. Everybody knew what they were going to say. So my strong advice on field hearings, they have high value, but they need to be authentic, and that it helps if the field office works with other entities in the state to identify not just who's going to be the quote that you know they're going to say, but how to respond to an ordinary person who came to the hearing, who has something they want to say. They can be vetted, of course, in order not to have something uncomfortable, but keep them authentic. Do not over-orchestrate them.
Dr. Ornstein?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. First, more broadly, I think probably my most quixotic venture here has been to change the schedule, which I've tried to do for decades. And if I could do one thing and wave my magic wand, it would be that you would be in session 3 weeks out of 4, 5 days a week from 9 a.m. Monday till 5 p.m. Friday, and then you'd have 1 week off and you could go back home. And the other part of that, which is even harder, is the 15 days when you're in session, no fundraising. You have 15 days to do all of that. Because let's face it, deliberation has as its root deliberate. And there's nothing deliberate about what's done here. You're racing from one place to another, and you're almost never on the floor together. You go for a few minutes, and then if there aren't votes, I see members streaming off to the Capitol Hill Club or the National Democratic Club or somewhere else to do call time. It's not a great way to have debate and deliberation. But I know realistically that whenever party leaders have talked about that, I remember having a conversation with John Boehner when he became speaker and how he was going to change this schedule. And of course, the pushback was almost immediate. And we've seen the same thing on the other side. But that would be a great thing to do. And I would say on field hearings, just as with CODELs, which have increasingly become more partisan, and that's a shame, if you're together somewhere, traveling together, the opportunities to develop at least some sort of personal bond that will reduce the incentive to do personal attacks, and that may get a little bit of a meeting of the minds, even on issues that are a little bit below the surface of what become our more highly charged issues. It has value in and of itself, and it has the additional value that you'll end up with some witnesses in areas that would never be able to come to Washington, and you'll get different points of view. So I'd say the more the merrier.
Thank you. We are working on, we've been having talks about schedule too, so that's a whole other area. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're working hard to find solutions. I'll point out that it's easier to find solutions somewhere else than in here. I sit in this committee regularly as a budget committee member, and there are usually 4 majority witnesses and 1 minority witness. If anyone can tell me who the Republican and who the Democratic witnesses are here today, if you can't tell me that, it's because from a leadership perspective, our leaders have decided that we're going to be more productive, we're going to be more deliberative if we don't do it that way. And so while we look to you for easy solutions, I've always believed if we had a better caliber member, we would have a better caliber Congress, and we have a better committee because of the caliber of our leadership here, and everybody on this committee recognizes it. I see my friend Don Wolfensberger in the back. He wrote a paper recently on debate and deliberation, and candidly, I confess I'd never thought about it. We used those words together. He was quoting Stephen Smith in Called Order, defining deliberation as a reasoning together about the nature of a problem and solutions to it, and debate as a verbal contest between people of opposing views. Those are inherently not the same thing, and so. While I have at least 5 minutes of questions for each one of you, I wanted to focus on you, Dr. Curry, because you went after regular order. I sit on the Rules Committee too. I struggle with the chicken and the egg of that. As a Rules Committee member, I don't provide an hour for debate. I don't provide an hour for deliberation. I provide an hour for debate. Regular order, when it was around, we had fewer amendments offered on appropriations bills when they were open than we allow now under a structured rule, because members were exerting their influence, getting their opportunities in different ways. I would tell you that we're becoming more leadership-centric through the absence of regular order, and devolving that power to committee chairmen and members brings back some of the civility. I might be fighting the Democratic leader, but I love my Democratic chairman, right? I mean, that natural dynamic. How are you convinced that regular order will be an opportunity for partisans to run amok, as opposed to opportunities for those partisans to change their views and become collaborators?
I think that view is based on partially what we saw happen throughout the 70s and the 80s as things became more partisan, but we still had fairly open procedures on the floor, and from the conversations and interviews I've done with people who were in the Congress at that time who were making these decisions about why they closed things down. And then the answer they gave over and over again was, as things opened up, and especially in conjunction with recorded electronic roll call votes becoming the norm in the mid-1970s, open processes just made it really easy for members of Congress who wanted to put messaging votes on the floor, who weren't trying to actually substantively change the legislation, whether it was the floor or also in committee, as we get closer to the modern times where all committee hearings are recorded and televised, as they are here, and committee markups are as well, and you can see who voted which way. It created opportunities for those folks who wanted to blow things up to blow things up. And the reaction to that was to close things down, and maybe that's an overreaction, but I mean, you all have seen, like, when things are open on the floor, what kind of chaos that can look like. I'm pessimistic that if we just started opening things up, that would work itself out and we work our way back, and I think it speaks to your point about the difference between debate and deliberation. When the cameras are on, when you're on the floor, when you're in a markup and it's something contentious, that's debate, that's arguing. Deliberation is something I think that has to happen before that, before you get to that point when you don't have that kind of atmosphere.
I think about the self-policing that can go on. Tom Graves is the dean of the Georgia delegation on the Republican side of the aisle. Folks get out of line. It's his job to come and try to protect the state of Georgia, try to get folks back on the same page. That was, when I got here in 2011, also true. Sure, Woodall, you can go down and offer an amendment on this open rule if you'd like, but just so you know, I'd do it for you in the committee markup if you would just come to me in committee. If you embarrass me on the floor by offering it, you'll never see that amendment come out of committee, but you do whatever you think is best. All right, I mean, that self-policing is less obvious in a leadership-driven structure, because when majorities are tight, oftentimes my leadership needs me more than I need my leadership. Is there anything that you learned in those interviews that would, for a fellow who does support regular order and who wants to believe that our better angels will prevail, anything that you learned that would support that and would be the baby step to see who's right about how to move forward?
In terms of ways you can go have a more open process without
A more deliberative process.
more deliberative open process. I mean, I really think I am really pessimistic, and I wish I had a clear-cut solution where we do this, and now you will have wonderful deliberations in committee and on the floor. I'm really convinced in the current political climate, you can't have deliberations on with the cameras on. And I think that's really frustrating. I don't think that's a good thing by any means, but I'm really pessimistic without the political climate more broadly, or without the norms changing around how members of Congress react to the political climate changing, that it's going to be possible to have those kinds of real deliberations in those kinds of open public settings.
You may not know, Mr. Chairman, if this is the new Budget Committee room. The old Budget Committee room, the dais was, we sat facing one another, Republicans and Democrats, and the quality of debate has devolved just over 2 years, because instead of looking at one another no further away than you and I are, I now am maligning my friend who I can't even see through my peripheral vision 40 feet away. That it does make a difference. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Chairman Kilmer, Mr. Graves, and thank you all for being here today. This is one of the issues that I've been most interested in and finding solutions to in our effort and modernization of the Congress. So I appreciate your input and suggestions. Let me just, there's been a lot of talk about Codels and the exchange program, for instance. I think when somebody said something about the Codels turning partisan, I saw a reaction. I wanted to hear about that a little bit. But let me put in a plug for the exchange program, if I may. And I'm going to plagiarize something Mr. Kilmer said when we had an exchange. I went to his district, he came to mine, and something that stuck with me, he said it's something along the lines of, it's really hard to know where someone's coming from if you don't know where they come from. And so, simple as that, but it's very true, and it's very helpful to walk a mile in another person's shoes in their district. So I would suggest that to anybody and everybody that may be listening. I think it's truly is a good thing. Congressman Aguilar and I have done that as well, and it truly is a positive thing. Codels just also build those relationships. So just to comment on I think I agree, we need to do more of those kinds of things. Build those relationships, and then it's harder to talk trash about somebody you actually care about, right? One of the things I've said, halfway in jest sometimes, but very seriously too, is that we ought to get rid of these darn cameras. I think it really impedes the debate, the deliberation, both of those things, because it just turns into a, we're not speaking to the people in the room, we're speaking to the people that are watching, or we assume are watching. But how do you do that without, I think, Dr. Curry, you talked about transparency. That's why they're here, so that the people can see what we're doing. So I'm a proponent of having more private places to be able to discuss things. I think those kind of work sessions are very productive, but how do you get over that transparency issue?
That's a good question, because the pull to be transparent is really strong, both because one, I mean, in many ways, transparency is good, but in other ways, when you're not being transparent, voters and citizens want to know like what you're doing wrong, what are you hiding? That's why to some degree, I think you couldn't just now turn the cameras off, right? You couldn't just say committee hearings are now off camera and off record. You would get such a negative backlash, but you can create opportunities for members to get together and supplement to traditional markups, traditional hearings, whether it's to go and study a topic, whether it's to go and hear from an expert, whether it's to go and do something else. In those settings, as supplements to the work that the committees are already doing, could be fruitful because you're getting information, you're having opportunities to actually deliberate and talk with each other, but outside of these normal processes where the cameras are on, the lights are on, and you don't know what's going to be used against you or whatever. I think maybe that's the most pragmatic way forward, even if, a more aggressive break from like uber transparency that we have might be even more useful in terms of promoting real deliberations.
So maybe in doing that, that would allow people to understand each other a little more, and then we wouldn't have those made for social media moments as much, perhaps.
There's a significant irony here, too, if you look at this from the public's point of view. The original intention around the cameras is to create transparency and make it more visible to the American public what's happening here. And yet the very presence of the cameras has changed the behavior in a way that what Americans are seeing only further feeds their own cynicism and distrust of what's happening in the halls of Congress. So I think there would be a place for a recognition on the public's part, as well as on your part, that anybody in your life needs both public spaces to behave that have to be transparent because we're actually conducting business at that point. But in order to get to that point, we have to have these more informal places that are not on camera, that are not set up for transparency's sake, to actually do the deliberation that allows us to behave the way we want.
So I would say, we're not going to turn off the C-SPAN cameras in the chamber. And we're not likely to turn off the cameras in formal committee hearings. So I would make 2 points. One is use the cameras to best advantage, which is where these primetime debates could do it, where the incentive is not going to be to necessarily just score some points, but actually show a better face for Congress. The second is if you do roundtables, and they're not formal hearings, they're roundtables where you're either going to have a discussion among the members or you're going to bring in some outside experts to interact with you, you can do that in a closed fashion. And it will give you a better opportunity to work together, and it might lead to more enlightenment than you'll find if it's a hearing where if people are watching you, that is going to include those people who are going to try and push you to be more tribal.
Well, thank you very much again for being here. This is important stuff, and appreciate your input. You're back.
Thank you. Mrs. Brooks.
Thank you all so much for being here and for your expertise. Something that I haven't heard being discussed yet is the staff's role in all of this. And while, because it often seems that so many of the deliberation is being done actually at staff level. And so what experience maybe have you seen, Dr. Lukens Meyer, with state legislatures or others where either staff have been brought into changing the way that deliberation happens or doesn't happen?
Very important that you're pointing that out. And I think actually staying right here in Washington, the kind of work that's being done with chiefs of staff in the Senate, the kind of work that's being done with chiefs of staff in the House, it's the same dynamic. They need an opportunity to meet one another, to form relationships, to be able to actually explore the territory that their bosses might in fact find compromise in. One of the things we have heard from members is that in some cases the staff is more partisan than the members, that in fact the way the staff are treating one another is part of what creates the conflict between offices. And in that case, I think it is the members' responsibility when you receive that feedback to actually have a direct conversation with staff in terms of your intentions about how you want them to link you with offices across the aisle. But I'm really glad you brought this up because the same principles we've been talking about in terms of relationships have to be built in order to productively work in the context of the House of Representatives and/or the Senate. And if the staff is part of the issue of creating unintended consequences and more partisanship, then they too really have to be brought to task, whether that's a management issue or a skills issue.
Thank you for bringing that up. Although staff, from what I observe, they're typically negotiating and working on these tough issues off of camera, you know, in what would be more deliberative processes. But and so while we might like to think that it's the cameras that cause the problems, and in part, that's not the case with staff. Any other thoughts on what we might recommend with respect to staff?
Yeah, and I think you probably heard a little bit about this when you had your hearing on capacity, a couple weeks ago, or whenever it was, that, you know, it's probably easier for staff to develop better relationships, have better discussions, have better deliberations at their level if you can keep them around. And as we all know, there's a lot of turnover in staff in Capitol Hill. Staff pay isn't great. Other dynamics of working on Capitol Hill can be tough. And so potentially in creating an environment where it's easier to keep staff, easier to pay them well, you can have staff that can develop the kind of relationships that we hope members do too over a long period of time. They know each other. They can have like conversations with trust that things won't leak out or things won't blow up. And that could itself at that level help members also find agreement through their staff.
Thank you. Dr. Ornstein?
So, you know, it's hard for me not to look back to where it was in my time in some ways, but there were times when you had a core, permanent professional staff on committees that was, for many committees, not for all, quite nonpartisan or at least bipartisan. And people would stick around for a sizable period of time through chairs, through changes in party control in many cases, and they provided a body of expertise, and there was a sense of camaraderie. People who could have gone out and made a lot more money doing other things stuck around because they were doing important work. And we've lost that. Now, I don't know if we can get it back. I will tell you that I don't like term limits for chairs, in part because what I've seen is when you have a turnover in the committee chairmanship, now you get new chairs coming in and they get rid of the staff from the previous chair, or at least a lot of them. And it means that you lose that body of expertise, and you lose the sense of loyalty to a committee or to the Congress, which means there's more of an incentive for people to kind of think about becoming a lobbyist, which I think changes also just the whole mindset that people have and how they deal with outside groups or how they deal with issues. And I don't know how we get that back, but I'd sure like to think through ways in which we could have a larger body of more permanent expertise in this chamber that reflects a sense of institutional patriotism that the members need to have more as well. You're the first branch of government. You're the first body in the first branch of government. Be that independent branch. Develop your own expertise. Use it in the ways that the first branch is supposed to operate. And we've lost a lot of that in this tribal world.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thanks. I think a few of us have a few more questions, if you're all right with that. I keep coming back to this question around the committee deliberation process, and a lot of the recommendations that you've made are things that are allowed to happen right now, right? I mean, our committee has done roundtables and work sessions, to your point, that when you have a roundtable and a work session, it doesn't need to be on camera. Certainly when we have public hearings like this, appropriately it's on C-SPAN. Committees are allowed to do staggered seating. They're allowed to look at the rules of the debate even. We've got at least one committee that's doing electronic voting in committee now to try to just expedite that time, with the notion that maybe if the committee has more time, it will be spent on debate and deliberation rather than on saying aye or nay repeatedly on repeated amendments. So the question I guess I have is, so put yourself in our shoes, right? So we can make recommendations. Certainly we could say, you're allowed to do these things, be aware you're allowed to do these things. The alternative is try to do something structurally, right, with incentives. I don't know exactly what that looks like. And I would value if you have thoughts about what that could look like. I'd love to hear any thoughts. You know, I've kicked around, and it's always dangerous to think out loud in a public hearing on C-SPAN, but but I think we're on like C-SPAN 7, so it's all right. The question is, you know, like, could you create almost like a performance agreement between the majority and the minority on a committee? And if you have that agreement, you get, you know, maybe the committee gets more funding, or maybe there's some sort of expedited procedure for consideration of bills out of the committee. I don't know. I'm just trying to think through, how do you create the incentives so you have a better agreement for the majority and the minority to have the committee do stuff on behalf of the American people? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think you're on the right track in that you have to create incentives, or you have to create, you know, punishments for committees not doing the things that you want them to do. So if you want them to do more site visits or field hearings or to do more studies, you could have it in the rules, whether it's the committee rules of the chamber or the party, that the committee shall have such number of things that each member has to attend, or have to attend a certain number of them, or else they lose their seat and position on the committee. Would seem like it would be a pretty tough punishment, that if you aren't attending these site visits, if you aren't attending these roundtables, if you aren't doing the following things as members of the committee, you're off the committee. And as chairs and ranking members of the committee, if you aren't scheduling these, you lose your power on that committee and it's given to someone else. Something like that, which, you know, members would have to agree to, but once it's in place, could sort of force committees to sort of, okay, we have to do this many things. Members have to show up for them. Now they're in place, and there's an actual punishment if you don't.
I would say, you know, I'm not sure we're going to be able to do this through rules changes except to open up opportunities. So my suggestion would be, first, that you all go out and think about a half dozen subcommittees or more, people you know who are open to this, and go to them and really make a strong case that they ought to be doing this, and then track what they're doing. And then when it works, and when you find that the chairs and ranking members and the other members of those subcommittees say, you know, this is really better, then you all appear in front of each party's conference and make the case more broadly. And if you do it that way, and you know, you have the Democrats and Republicans who have done this, along with the members of your committee, appearing in front of the Democratic conference, caucus and the Republican conference, maybe you will be able to spread it more widely. And when it comes to the floor debates, you just have to get the leaders of both parties to agree to try it a few times, and I think we'll see it working. Then we might be able to make some changes in rules, but I think it's going to happen kind of from a bottom-up way of recruiting some people who get this started and then have them spread the word.
So I agree with what both of you have said, that we need ambassadors to go out and spread it and convince others to join, and there should be both some carrots and some sticks. I guess the third thing I would add is, I think there really is a step that leadership needs to take at this point in time when the Select Committee is putting out its range of recommendations on these important issues. Whether that is a change in schedule, not as dramatic as the one that Norm was talking about, but a time in schedule that by definition, what's possible for committees to do in this time slot is this more informal way, or providing the funding for a retreat for the committee every year. So I think there need to be some incentives from the leadership level that send a signal, which say, yes, this is going to have to be a push from all of us, but we want to recognize that the chamber is ready to move in this direction. I think you have to do all of those things.
Let me recognize the vice chair. I may ask one or two more before we wrap it up, though.
Sure, thanks, Mr. Chairman. And my hope is, and you're absolutely right, Doctor, about ambassadors. Of this committee, 75% of this committee is planning to return next term. 25% of us are planning not to. But of the 75%, my hope is they will be the ambassadors. They're the future committee chairs, if not currently, in a role of a leadership role. And that when, I know Derek is going to be a chairman of a powerful committee, or maybe it might be a ranking member, of a powerful committee. But either way, my hope is that he will take this practice to whatever committee that is, and the others who are serving on this committee might as well, and be that example that it can be done even beyond this committee once we reach our term. But Dr. Lukens Meyer, as you were giving your opening remarks and presentation, you were laying out a lot of ideas and recommendations, and the chairman reminded me that you had a few more that you might wanted to go through a little bit further, a little bit deeper. Is there anything else that you want to cover today, or anything that's been stimulated your thought from some of the conversation? We just want to give you a chance to conclude your remarks that you wanted to do.
Well, I think we've covered some of it from the questions, but I'm really sorry that Representative Cleaver isn't here, because I think when he and Kay Granger were running the Civility Caucus in the House and created this body that they called the Working Group for a Working Congress, I think it's worth looking at what those recommendations were. It was very connected to the chairman and the ranking member and 2/3 of the committee members agreeing to work off-site before the session began to determine, they had at that stage 3 questions to put in front of them. What bills do we want to get on the floor this year? And I realize there's some issues there about how power's been sucked out of committees. How do we want to treat each other as members, both privately and publicly? And how do we want to treat the public in public hearings? Because at that stage, at least, there was also, and it's still today, issues about how members who are presenting in hearings are treated. And the agreement was to actually create, you used the phrase a performance contract. I don't remember if that was the phrase that was used, but over the course of a real working session for a couple of days, agreements would be made between the chair, the ranking member, and the members of the committee who presented, with then the accountability being held by the staff team in terms of following through on the contract that was signed. The idea was it would not happen in all members of all committees in Congress, but picking, and the thought at that time, which I think still has value, is picking a couple of committees that the American public pays more attention to the outcomes of the committee. Currently, Veterans Affairs would be a good example. The big ones like Transportation and Agriculture with the Farm Bill and ICE-T, where there's consequences beyond highly partisan constituents, where people understand what product comes out of this committee is really a reflection of whether the Congress is doing the country's work. And I think if the Select Committee wanted to pursue a recommendation like that, it would be intensive work in a couple of committees to demonstrate that you could get better dialogue and deliberation and to some compromise that has not really been accomplished frequently in the recent past. I think it's worth revisiting.
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Lukens Meyer, thinking about your observation that you've seen bipartisan seating charts and retreats and arrangements produce more bipartisan legislation, I have no doubt that would produce more congressional gold medal bills, more bipartisan report requests to executive branch committees. My question is, do we have any evidence that it produces more solutions to once-in-a-generation entitlement reform, once-in-a-generation tax reform, once-in-a-generation social services reform?
I don't have any examples on the entitlement programs, but one that comes to mind is in Idaho, where a very significant issue in the state legislature is the control of federal lands. And out of the work that was done there with the entire legislature, some compromises on some bills that really mattered did move forward that hadn't moved forward, I believe it was about a decade. So I think it can work on some tough ones. I don't know in terms of demonstrating a shift to this kind of work that I would pick Social Security as the start place, but it does seem to me that was the part of the goal of the working group, is let's pick tough issues that have to be dealt with by Congress and see if we can do a better job of it. I hope that's helpful.
It is. And off topic of what we're doing today, but because you're all students of what happens here, I recognize this is a majority institution, and the leadership needs to be able to run this institution. 435 folks can't run amok. But the witness distribution at committees Do you find institutional need for 4-to-1 ratios? I just don't have to recognize you if you're the minority witness, Dr. Curry. I can just spend all my questions over here. Is there a harm to the institution to institutionalizing bipartisan witness panels, even as partisanship continues to reign on the dais? Dr. Ornstein?
First answer is no, there isn't. And I'd like to see changes in the way things are done. But I'd also like to see examples where it's not majority witnesses and minority witnesses, where it's expert witnesses or witnesses who have something to offer. And they don't have to be, PhDs and people who are at the top of their fields. They may end up being veterans who have experience with PTSD or service dogs, or it might be farmers who have been harmed by trade policies or whatever else it may be. But the way we've broken it down, it's pitting majority witnesses against minority witnesses. And when that happens, the majority is going to have way too many incentives to minimize the role of the minority. But even as a general matter, having it be 4-to-1 instead of 3-to-2 is, I think, a mistake, because it just reinvigorates a minority into a feeling of being aggrieved. I can tell you, even going back, when Democrats had the majority here for 40 years, and I was close to a lot of the people on both sides of the aisle, we had a fairly regular practice in subcommittees where proxies would be used. And the chairs of subcommittees would listen to ideas from the minority that often were very constructive ones, and then they would just use, and there'd be one majority member there and maybe 4 minority members, and they just pull out a set of proxies and vote them down. And it was because they could. And that was a mistake, and it was a mistake in terms of getting better policy, not just a misuse of power. Both parties, when they have that power, need to step back and think about how best to use it to serve the goals that we all have in the institution. But you also don't want to see a situation where a minority exploits these kinds of things and turns it into, just a shouting match. So I think there are better ways to do this, and you're providing some examples. I think one of the great values of this committee may be not just in the recommendations you make, some of which will be accepted and some of which will not, some of which will be adopted and then never implemented, but just the way you're operating shows that there's a different way of doing business, and for that I applaud you.
No one defending the partisan division. All right. Well, to Dr. Ornstein's point, we have a lot of scheduling conversations up here, and those conversations would be easier if folks thought their 5 days a week, 16 hours a day would be spent on constructive policymaking instead of more partisan hearings, so that more people can get more social media hits in an unproductive way. And what you all have helped us with today, I think will move us in that direction. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you all for your expertise.
Mrs. Brooks.
Thank you. Dr. Ornstein, in your written testimony, you talked about an idea that you've proposed. I just reread it. For decades, you said the idea of having a weekly primetime Oxford-style debate over a national issue. Can you, and the significant issues covering the nation, I mean, a topic that just came up that we really didn't have, I think, adequate debate on, that both sides wanted to have, was the AUMF debate that we just had or didn't really have. What mechanism would you propose be implemented to ensure that the choice of the debate topic cover, the important issues either at the time, or that we have these important debate issues not at the exact time that we need to have them, but are able to have them when maybe the emotion of the issue is not at the forefront?
In an ideal world, there would be either a working group, call it a working group, where you'd get members who understand what this is about and have the value, and each, maybe a few weeks in advance, choose a topic that everybody could agree on, pick the members, and schedule the debate. And I think the AUMF is a prime example. It's also one where you're not necessarily going to have Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other. It is of extraordinary importance to the country people need to know about how we make decisions about authorizing the use of military force, going to war, putting our troops in harm's way, and why, and what role Congress should play. And if I could do one debate right now in prime time, I'd pick 4 really good members and have them divided, not just on partisan lines, and do an hour or 2, do an hour with 4 people, and then open it up for another hour or 2 in the evening for a broader ranging discussion. I think it would be of enormous value to the American people, and it would show a Congress that's serious about its own responsibilities. That's what I would do.
And while it doesn't happen in debate format, I wouldn't say, when I came to Congress 8 years ago, I thought in some ways, naively, that that might be a bit of what caucuses did. And that the caucuses, are created around a significant issue or topic area. We bring in a lot of experts for briefings, which are often fabulous, to be honest, but no members really attend. Staff attend. C-SPAN might be watching, maybe, not often. But there's actually a lot of terrific ideas and discussions that come out during our caucus briefings when we have them around different topics. Any other ideas in my time left on having a national regular debate on the tough issues in prime time and the manner in which Dr. Ornstein's suggesting? Which I agree would be incredibly helpful. It's hard imagining it happening necessarily, but I think it would be very helpful.
This is very simple, but I think from the American public's point of view, at least in the work we do with the public, what the topics for that should be are very evident, whether it's authorizing military force, whether it's immigration. So those are known very far ahead of time. So actually scheduling for a year, not connected to an immediate thing that has just happened in a fight between the president and the Congress, but having them on the books in enough time to structure them and both use expert testimony and have members participate would be a great way to structure it.
Dr. Curry, any other comments?
I mean, I like the idea quite a bit because I think an important role of the Congress that we don't always think about is expressing the views of different people in the citizenry. That's right. Your jobs aren't just to make laws, your jobs are also to represent those views in some sort of national assembly. I do worry that these debates wouldn't work tremendously well if they're on really hot button partisan issues, which unfortunately is a lot of the major challenges that you all face, which is part of the fundamental challenge of doing any of the fostering deliberations or passing legislation. So maybe if the goal is to start this process, it's really about starting by picking issues that clearly don't just fall always down partisan lines, like the authorization of use of military force. And I'm sure you could come up with others, but that may allow for more dynamic, less partisan debate in the first few, which maybe would spill over into the future.
Dr. Ornstein, since you've thought about this and written about this apparently over a couple of decades, do you have any particular name you would give this?
I would call it the Great American Debates.
Thank you. I yield.
Before we wrap, I want to, so both the vice chair and I think others here came from legislative bodies. 2 things struck me when I got here. One, that debate by and large happened in a mostly empty chamber, which was a very big difference than when I was in the state legislature, where frankly, there were times where my mind got changed by participating and just listening to that debate. Secondly, every bill that I voted on in the Washington State Legislature was done under an open rule. And I don't think I go on to 2 hands times where that got gamed for political purposes. So contrast that with this place. Obviously, the only time where all the members are on the floor for the debate is for truly the most toxic debate we have, which is on the MTR, which rather than being in the spirit of an open rule, something that was truly designed to change the bill, it's a gotcha for political, and that's regardless of which party's in charge, that is the case, right? The minority uses it as a gotcha that can be used in nasty political ads. It strikes me that these problems are normative, though, right? I mean, you set norms that you would not abuse an open rule. Members were on the floor because there was an expectation that you would be on the floor for floor debate. So as we look at the sort of charge of this committee and our general goal of having a Congress that works better on behalf of the American people, I find myself wondering, so what are some of the things you can do to change those norms, right? The notion of empowering people in committee, with regard to who the witnesses are, with regard to how you can deliberate, that could help, right? Because sometimes I feel like legislators who aren't empowered, it's like my dog when I don't walk it, right? He chews the furniture. And I think you see furniture chewing in this context when members don't feel empowered. And so I guess I'm curious, so, the discussion around committee collaboration might get there. Frankly, the discussion around doing a great American debate might at least get members to listen to each other about issues that matter. Are there other things, as I lay out some of those normative challenges, are there other things you think this committee ought to be thinking about making recommendations on? It's hard to make recommendations to change norms. Give us a little guidance.
I would just start with going back to the schedule. If we're going to be a Tuesday afternoon through Thursday afternoon body with all the pressure to raise money for your own election and for your team and for the leadership PACs and all of that, and you have all the committees and subcommittees and the hearings, people are going to be racing around. They're going to go into a committee, stay maybe so they get their 5 minutes and then leave to go to something else, and you're not going to get people on the floor. We have to find a way to have at least extended periods where those incentives change. Second, it's got to come from the top and from the leadership at the top. I remember having a conversation with my friend David Price, who I knew before he came to Congress as one of the great scholars of Congress. And when David was the chair of an appropriations subcommittee, he would say, we still have those norms in the committee. We all work together, and then we get our bills, and we pass our bills through the subcommittee and the committee, usually unanimously. And then when we get to the floor, the minority members vote against their own bill, because that's the pressure coming from the leadership that you're going to set this out as what they're doing and not what we're doing. And if you don't have leaders who understand that it is in everybody's interest to make those changes, we got an uphill battle. We can still do it from the bottom up. But there's no easy way to change norms. It is the case maybe that and I'm looking, as I focus, and Carolyn and I are on a commission on citizenship for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We're meeting later this week. We understand that there's no panacea to the larger political dysfunction we have, but if you don't change the structures and the rules, you're going to have a harder time changing the norms. So it has to be done in both ways, but if we can't get the leaders at the top to agree, we're not going to be able to do anything except push that uphill and then keep pushing.
Widely recognized in all of social science that changing norms is really difficult, particularly much easier to take a positive norm and destroy it than to actually recreate a positive norm once it's been degraded. And I think this has been said, but just to try to say it simply, it's got to be worked on from three perspectives simultaneously. There has to be a structural change, system change that I spoke about earlier, directly connected to that norm, so it's an incentive or a punishment, whatever. There has to be leadership support for it, and there has to be pressure for it from the ground up. Call them ambassadors, but only one of those elements won't do it. The strategy to do it has to involve specific tactics on all three of those perspectives. And then you have to be in for the long haul. You have to make a commitment that if we really want to get to a place for the kinds of norms that you were describing, it's going to take us a decade to get it back.
Anything to add? Okay. All right. I'd like to thank our witnesses for your testimony today. I thought this was a good and meaty hearing. Before we wrap up, I want to thank the Budget Committee for letting us squat in their room and the person who's transcribing our proceedings. Thank you. although I think you missed the great Nickelback debate. I'd like to also thank the band Nickelback for
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
persistent entertainment, not from a musical sense, but at least from a policymaking sense, and also to the Select Committee staff for putting together this great hearing. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.